Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everyone. I guess this is our last show before the election, before the midterms, right?
Last year for the midterms, this is our chance to embarrass ourselves with completely off the mark predictions. I keep trying to get out of the predictions game, but I just did a couple of radio appearances in the past couple days, and they always put you on the spot. They always say, what's your gut tell you? And I'm like, my gut's always wrong. Why are you asking me? I can't help you here. But we do it anyway, just to humiliate ourselves.
Okay, so how many seats? How many seats do you think Republicans pick up in the Senate?
Let's talk it out first. I haven't done the numbers in my head this morning, so I don't want to be overly precise.
I can tell you, I had Alexis Levinson from Roll Call and Josh Krausar from National Journal's Hotline on my podcast this week to talk about it. And unfortunately, I miscounted on the podcast and I gave out the wrong total. But it turns out they were both predicting nine Republican, a nine seat pickup in the Senate, which is I think would be sort of on the top end of what anybody's expecting. The other point too, I think that bears mention is it's possible we won't know until January, because if Georgia goes into a runoff, that's not till January 6th, I think.
Right.
If nobody gets 50%, then they have a runoff. Louisiana will probably have a runoff. And then Alaska could take days before we know, what happens there. So
and Louisiana also goes into a runoff if no one's at 50.
Yeah, exactly. So we may not know number one, we may not know if Republicans have enough to take the Senate, and even if we do know that, we may not know how many. If we were to say 7, I think Republicans gain 7 seats. We may not know that until January. And the other thing is, as Josh Krausar, a pretty astute point he made on the podcast with me, is that if Republicans, let's say Republicans have a great night Tuesday and they kind of run the table and they, basically take the Senate majority without Louisiana and Georgia. Well, that could impact Louisiana and Georgia, because you could have voters say, well, Michelle Nunn, we don't want Democrats to run things, but now that Harry Reid's already gone, he's not going to be the majority leader anyway. Let's go with Nunn. So you could have voters sort of strategically voting. So there's so many variables, it's hard to predict, right?
It is, and I feel like there's so much punditry now that is assuming Republican takeover. And look, I generally accept sort of these statistical forecasts that say they have a 65% chance or so. I think it's what's 538 has it right now. They have a better than even chance of getting it. That's not the same as a 100% chance of getting it. There's plenty of uncertainty just based on the polling alone. And so almost every single race that's competitive is not just technically within the margin of error, like well within the margin of error. You're talking, 1, 2, 3 point differences in almost every poll. Yeah. And this is on the basis of subjective likely voter screens. The pollsters have to make some kind of gut judgment who is actually going to show up to vote or not, how they're going to weigh those numbers. You don't know if those assumptions are correct. You don't know how good the ground games are. I'm not going out there and saying, I know the Democrat ground game is so awesome, therefore there will be all these upsets. But it does seem a situation rife for surprises, because people are making, I think, very certain assumptions based on incomplete information.
Yeah, well, we never know what's going to happen, and there are always surprises. Like, everything else could go great for Republicans, and Cory Gardner could lose, who's up by 7 points or something crazy in the latest poll I saw. So there's always big surprises, or you could have things like Scott Walker losing in Wisconsin. Doesn't look like that's the case right now, but you could have you definitely could have big surprises. I would say though, everything sort of historically that everything we know about politics says that Republicans are going to win. I mean, for one thing, I think the average in the sort of a president's sixth term, in a president's second term, 6 year, the midterm. I think they tend to. I think the average is 8 seats that they lose, that the incumbent president's party loses.
Right.
So Republicans only need 6. So even if they underperform the average, sixth year of a presidency, they would take the Senate. I think you clearly have a case where the Senate seats that just happen to be up this time really favor Republicans. Democrats are defending, red states where Romney won big, and McCain. So you've got that. And then, frankly, the final, sort of the third ingredient would be that the political environment really favors them. I mean, the big news for weeks now has been ISIS and Ebola. And that has been the dominant sort of news story heading into the final week of the election. And I think everyone is pretty much in agreement that those issues skew Republican. So,
I depart with you on that last part. I agree with you on the other two. I definitely think the skewed map is huge. 6-year itch. The president's party's base tends to be more demoralized after the party in power has to deal with lots of tough decision making, deal with frustrations like that. That's a historical. I think there's a basis for that history. So I agree with the first two. I never really bought the notion that Ebola and ISIS really, break one way. And now I feel like both those stories are fading. I feel like those stories are even at the top of the news right now. And I never really got how you make a very easy connection between that and the Senate candidate or the House candidate. You might criticize the president's handling of the two. But
I completely disagree. I think that nobody's going to go into the polls and vote and say I'm voting Republican because of national security or whatever. But I think there's a general feeling out there that we're under attack, that things just aren't right, and that there's a sort of a fear that's promulgating the atmosphere. And I think that turns soccer moms into security moms, basically. And I think that these issues skew toward Republicans. I've talked about this a bit, so I don't want to repeat myself. Did I talk about my theory about how Maslow's hierarchy of needs fits into this whole thing, Bill? Did we talk about that last week?
I think we talked about that last week.
Okay, so I won't go into it really here, but I feel like that these are sort of primal, basic survival sort of instincts that are kicking in, and I think that they benefit Republicans going into the election.
But the most recent Ebola story we have is the Christie fight with the Maine nurse, where here's Chris Christie. He's trying to reemerge from his sort of a political wilderness after Bridgegate. He kind of spent most of the year keeping out of the national spotlight, trying to get back, firm up his base at home. Didn't do a lot of national media. He also heads the National Governors Association, so he's been the Republican Governors Association. So he's been focused on a lot of the governors' races across the country. So this past Sunday, he does his first Sunday talk show appearance since Bridgegate in seemingly friendly turf, Fox News Sunday, and he comes on. He follows the head of the CDC. And the CDC person is saying, look, there really just isn't science backing this notion of 21-day quarantines for all health workers. There's a big concern about negative consequences if you can't recruit healthcare workers to go to Africa because they don't want to get slapped with a mandatory quarantine for 3 weeks, even if they have no symptoms. Then you can't attract the people you need to go to West Africa. And that's where you have to stop the outbreak. So that's not a good strategy. Then Chris Christie shows up after this, after a public health professional delivers the science on the subject and starts acting like he knows better than the public health professionals. that, oh, well, the CDC, they're a moving target. They keep moving the goalposts. No one believes what they have to say anymore. And I believe that they're going to come around to my position in a matter of days. The very next day after he's trash-talking to CDC, he springs the nurse he had under quarantine in New Jersey and ships her to Maine. It just seems like here you have the blustery bully all over again who can't even back up his own trash talk. And I generally believe that Ebola is a non-factor in the Senate races, but the extent that you think that it isn't the fact that the big story coming into Tuesday is Christie getting humiliated, and the notion of knee-jerk quarantines might not be all it's cracked up to be if one of its main proponents can't even follow through.
Well, I'll unpack it a little bit. First, you say the friendly confines of Fox News. I think that it was a pretty I think that Chris Wallace is a very good interviewer, and I don't think it was softballs by any means. I think he was asking, tough but fair questions of Christie, and I think Christie handled it very well. I think it was a very good Fox News Sunday performance by Christie. I think that he's with 80% of the public, I think, something like that, thinks that we ought to be doing these quarantines. He may be right, he may be wrong, but I think that the position he was advocating is entirely defensible. The CDC has, the protocols have changed. And so, fair or not, I think it's safe to question whether or not now they're right, because they might not have been right before. So I think Christie, I think it was a pretty tough interview. I think he handled it really well. I came away thinking, just a great communicator, and he's sort of on the side of the public, whether he's right or wrong. I don't get why he backed down the next day. That's the part that I don't get. Presumably there was some lobbying from the Obama administration, looming possible threats of lawsuits. What's that?
I mean, he might have realized he'd have a very good legal leg to stand on. So he said, it's Maine's problem now, not mine.
Well, then maybe you shouldn't have gone on Fox News. That's
yeah.
That's the question. I mean, I was with them. I thought it was actually, I think that the quarantine idea is utterly defensible, and I think his performance defending it was quite good rhetorically. What I don't get is why then he backs down immediately, and what changed, and I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, he's just such a. I mean, I think he's got a tough road to hoe in 2016, regardless. But certainly he would be in better shape. I mean, people can clear their low bars by adjusting their persona, showing they've learned lessons. But here, Christie's reemergence on the big stage is one. I think this debacle, and then the very next day is a Hurricane Sandy event. And there's a heckler there criticizing his efforts with the Hurricane Sandy relief, and then Christie tells the guy to sit down and shut up. I mean, it just seems like this guy does not understand that if you want him for president of the United States, and by his own words on Fox, he is seriously considering it, and presumably, I'd imagine he's going to announce, in a matter of a couple of months. I imagine there'll be a bunch of announcements, come January 2015. He doesn't seem like he is in the mindset of someone who has to campaign in states that are not New Jersey.
Yeah.
And adapt to social convention in the Midwest and in the South and in rural parts of the country and whatnot.
Well, and too, when he backed down, Rush Limbaugh hit him. Rush, I think a day later, walked back that a little bit. But, when you can't make friends of your enemies by making enemies of your friends. And when Christie sort of stands up and says this quarantine's the right thing to do, and then we all sort of defend him, and then he backs away from it. He essentially lets all of his defenders get thrown under the bus. The other thing, too, that happened this week with Christie was the Scott Walker stuff, right? So late last week, I think, there was some grumbling from some unnamed Christie aides who were some unnamed Walker aides who were implying that the Republican Governors Association wasn't doing enough to help Scott Walker in Wisconsin, that he's in grave danger of losing to Mary Walker, the gubernatorial race, which would essentially ruin his presidential chances. And there was some insinuation that Christie maybe sees Walker as a presidential rival and is kind of hoping that Walker loses. Then later, earlier this week, Walker actually spoke publicly and took what seemed to be a few shots at Christie publicly, and basically said, someone said, well, isn't Christie coming to the state to campaign for you? And Walker was like, well, we don't really need more surrogates. He asked if he could come, and I said, fine, but we don't really need more surrogates. So Christie has had kind of a rough week, and, but I do think, though, I don't know how much of this sticks around or hurts him long term. Probably more important is how Republican governors do on Tuesday, and that obviously remains to be seen.
Yeah, I noticed in Maine, the Republican governor there, who's very right wing, and squeaked in a three-way race where the center and the left split 4 years ago, and he got in with a very small plurality. A similar dynamic was shaping up this time around, and then the third-party candidate, Elliot Cutler, announced that people should vote their conscience and be realistic. So he didn't quite drop out, but he basically signaled to his supporters, look, I'm not going to win this time. And Angus King, the independent senator from Maine, switched his allegiance from Cutler to the Democrat Mike Michaud. There's a Republican governor's ad running in Maine that is basically saying vote Cutler because it's targeting liberals in Maine. It's beating up on the Democrat Mike Michaud and saying, Cutler is a better choice. And it's just a transparently disingenuous play that falls at Christie's footsteps. So I don't know to the extent people are going to.
The interesting thing is that
blame Christie.
We talked about how friendly the turf is for Republicans this cycle and the Senate, right? I mean, Democrats are defending places like Arkansas, and you've got states like West Virginia and South Dakota and Montana that should be Republican seats. But in the governor's races, not the same, right? Republican governors are defending or trying to, they don't have. It's not as friendly. But here you have possibilities for Republicans to really expand the map, and in states like Maryland and Massachusetts, Bill, my state and your state, my home state and the state where you reside, it's a chance that Republicans could actually pick up gubernatorial seats there. And I think if that happens, the wave talk becomes.
You have. I'm sorry.
Well, then talk of a wave. I mean, everyone's focused on the Senate, but if Scott Walker comes back and if Republicans win in places like Maryland and Massachusetts, the gubernatorial seats. And I think it's true that Republicans are poised to take more state legislatures than ever in history, or have more Republican state legislature seats, something like that. You could start to make an argument that it's not just about the Senate, that Republicans are, despite the demographic challenges and the problems they've had in recent presidential years, that Republicans are really dominating and that the map has expanded.
No, there's a lot of cross currents here because yes, there's still going to be a chance for Republicans to make some very big state legislative gains. But if you have, Sam Brownback in Kansas lose, if you have Walker lose in Wisconsin, you have Nathan Deal in Georgia is also in trouble. If Tom Tillis, who's running for Senate in North Carolina, but he's the Speaker of the House of North Carolina, and these are all states that have pursued a very, very conservative state governing line, big tax cuts and the like. And the Republican governor of Pennsylvania is a sure loser, Corbett. Yeah. Whereas you have a number of Democrats who are very strong. The governor of New Hampshire is in very good shape. Jerry Brown in California. This is probably an underappreciated situation. Jerry Brown has literally not run a single ad in the state that says, I'm running for re-election, please vote for me. He has 3 ads that he's done, but all 3 are about voting for 2 ballot initiatives that he's supporting. One about water conservation and one about having a rainy day fund. And in one of the 3 ads, he kind of alludes to his gubernatorial record, but he doesn't actually say, I am running for re-election and I need your vote. He has a $21 million war chest that he's sitting on. He's not even spending it. He gave about $3 million to these proposition ads, and he said to Los Angeles Times, "I want to keep that money, so I'm not a lame duck governor, and I can use it on future ballot initiatives." And he's going to win this state, in probably more than 10% of the vote. Here it's a situation where simply just being good at your job is it just sort of belies the notion that you even need advertising to win an election. If you're seen as doing a good job as governor, that should be sufficient.
The problem is, Bill.
And he's saying,
well, as I say, the problem is we like narratives, and the World Series Game 7 last night, right? 2 competing narratives. It was either going to be Kansas City Royals Cinderella story, first time in 29 years, or it was going to be, as it turned out to be, Madison Bumgarner putting the team on his back and sort of becoming the Randy Johnson of the Giants, and that turned out to be the narrative. It's nice when we can have a narrative, and I think that those of us who write about politics would love to have some narrative. And this year, you're right, there are these cross currents, and I mean, all it takes is for Roberts and Brownback to go down and Walker to go down. And even if Republicans win in Massachusetts and Maryland, it's hard to really craft a narrative that way. We don't like that.
No,
we don't like that.
No, you're a Maryland native. I'm a Massachusetts transplant. Yes. So people did not think Maryland's gubernatorial race was going to be close at all, and now it's gotten tight. What's going on?
I mean, I'm still skeptical. It's hard for Republicans to win in Maryland. I mean, Bob Ehrlich did it once because of a bunch of circumstances, including Kathleen Kennedy Townsend running a really bad campaign. But in Maryland, you have the lieutenant governor, Anthony Brown, running against Republican Larry Hogan. And at least according to some polls, it's a couple, Hogan's just a couple points down. Bill, I want to tell I have a story about Larry Hogan Sr., Larry Hogan's dad. I thought about starting a super PAC to run negative ads against Larry Hogan, the Republican. So picture it, Frederick, 1998. A young Matt Lewis has just helped, was the campaign manager for a campaign for a guy named Alex Mooney, now running in West Virginia, who at 26 years old, became the youngest Republican ever elected in the state of Maryland. And this is sort of the triumph of my young career at this point. And he wins the race. I had organized the Victory Party for his campaign and for the Republican Party, Frederick County Republican Party, and it was at a fire hall. And I had booked this band that I had jammed with. It was a blues band called the Bad Influence Band. I jammed with them once at the Bent Street Raw Bar, and I booked them to play the Victory Party. And the deal was they were going to let me do one song with them. And so sort of, this is like me being like Lee Atwater or something. And so the election, my guy wins and everyone's excited and we go on stage and I'm doing Johnny B. Good. I'm doing lead guitar on Johnny B. Good, sort of Marty McFly without the histrionics. And this is like the pinnacle of my life up until this point, just on top of the world, on stage playing guitar. And all of a sudden, this old guy comes running up and like waving his hands and like shuts, like, like a movie when you can hear like the record, like the needle, like, sort of scratch a record and everything comes to a screeching halt. Well, that's what happens. Like right. The band like stops. And this like old man is like yelling, jumping up and down in front of his irate. Turns out to be former Congressman Larry Hogan, who was upset because while we were playing, it was declared that Ellen Sauerbrei had lost her gubernatorial bid, which we sort of expected. This was her second time around. I don't think anyone thought she was going to win that time. But anyway, Larry Hogan Sr. ruined what up until that point had been the pinnacle of my young life. Just the moment of sheer ecstasy where my one moment in the sun, he totally screwed. And I thought about starting a super PAC to run ads against his son. And think of me like me in front of the camera telling this story, but it should be like super dramatic and maybe like some flashback scenes and like eerie music. And then at the end, it would be something like, "Now, I can't guarantee that Larry Hogan Jr. won't ruin the dreams of another young man, but I can't guarantee he won't. Paid for by, you know." So anyway, I thought about doing that. I thought better of it. But anyway, that's my story about how Larry Hogan like totally stepped on the most like triumphant moment of my life up until that point and ripped it out.
Well, can you put aside your bias and your hostility to the Hogan family?
Oh yeah, by the way, his other let me just say this part too. The other Hogan, Congressman Hogan's other son, Patrick Hogan, ran in I think 2002 for state delegate in Maryland. He ran on a platform of he has a political science degree, and that qualifies him to be in the state house, and it worked. That was like his selling point, and voters like took that as like a coherent rationale for electing him. So, yeah.
So, are you able with clear eyes and an open heart be able to say here is what Larry Hogan Jr. has done right in this race to make it competitive?
I haven't followed it as closely because, frankly, I've tuned out Maryland politics, assuming that it was hopeless. And it's just been in the past week when I started to see, wow, he is closing in. This race is really tight, and it's not just an outlier. I mean, there are several polls that sort of show him trending this way, that he's closing in. The only thing that makes sense to me is that, number one, I think Hogan is running as sort of a Bob Ehrlich Republican, meaning, sort of a mainstream, not crazy Republican. He's also running, there are a few really compelling TV ads that I'm seeing here in the D.C. Media market, because Maryland gets, some parts of Maryland get the D.C. media market, and some get Baltimore. And there's one where there's an African-American woman talking about why she's supporting Hogan, and it seems to be quite well done. I think that when Bob Ehrlich won with Michael Steele as his running mate, that there was a clear attempt to peel off some of the black vote from the Democrats, and it seems like that may be part of the appeal here as well, to some degree. I mean, you're not going to win the African American vote, but they are at least competing. They're competing for it. They're trying for it. And then lastly, I think it just has to be the political environment. I mean, if Republicans win in Maryland this year, I mean, you would have to assume that at least some of it is attributable to the sort of political zeitgeist turning against the Obama. And in fact, Obama campaigned in Maryland last week. And I mean, this is somewhat anecdotal, but as he was speaking, the bleachers started to clear out. I mean, this was widely reported by mainstream media outlets that people were essentially leaving as Obama spoke. And then other anecdotal evidence is that, I think Michelle Obama is going to be stumping there. And Christie has made multiple visits to Maryland campaigning in recent days and weeks. And so it does seem like this is something I can't imagine that they would be this interested in, and that you would have the Obamas and Christie spending so much time in Maryland if it were hopeless.
Right. No, it does suggest that we're experiencing more of an anti-incumbent climate as opposed to, I think, an anti-democratic or anti-liberal climate. You looking at what is going on there, what going on in some other more conservative states where incumbents are.
If Hogan wins, let me just say this, if Hogan wins, I'm going to show up at his victory party and ruin his victory speech. That's what I'm going to do.
Now in Massachusetts, we have a close race here. The preponderance of polls give the Republican Charlie Baker, say 2-3 point edge, depending on what poll you look at. One poll has Baker up by 9, one poll has Coakley up by 4. So it's a bit of a mishmash. But people have a very bad attitude towards Martha Coakley. There's a big Politico magazine piece a couple weeks ago called Martha Chokley. Is she going to blow it again? Definitely Democrats. We ask people why are we voting for Martha Coakley? Well, she lost to Scott Brown 4 years ago. It's like, well, that's not really a reason to not vote for her now. But is there something about her positions that you don't like? People just people make weird connections in their head and don't always act rationally. But there's also a commentary that Martha's run a much better campaign than in the past, and she's not lollygagging it. She knows the backup quarterback for the Patriots. She's not even flubbing the sports questions this time around. So there's sort of a question of what's going on here. And I think there are a number of things about Massachusetts that people don't properly grasp. Number one is that Republicans in the past 25 years have done very well in governor's races. Only Deval Patrick is an exception to the rule, not what's commonplace. There is ever since Bill Weld in 1990 snuck in because he was more liberal than the Democrat who was running that year, because there is a conservative Democratic population in Massachusetts. There's one misnomer that Republicans always do badly in Massachusetts, which is the opposite is true in governor's races. And the second thing is that Democrats are monolithically liberal, which is also not true. There's one of the reasons why Republicans do well, they take advantage of that second misnomer and say we can't have one party rule in the state. You need to have a Republican governor to keep the Democratic legislature.
Yeah, people
in check.
think Massachusetts is so liberal. I would say I would definitely argue that Maryland is a tougher state than Massachusetts.
May well be. I mean, certainly has more of a history of Democratic governors in the past few elections than Massachusetts does. I was actually just looking at one of those legislative scorecards that Progressive Massachusetts does. They rate the votes of all the state legislators. The range for Democrats, it goes from like 20% to 80%. I mean, this is because Republicans are not a strong party in Massachusetts, a lot of conservatives become Democrats to win elections. And so you have a pretty diverse state party in Massachusetts. So you really don't need a Republican governor to keep one party in check because it's a diverse party. But nevertheless, people have that perception. There's lots of things about state politics people don't like. There's always a potential to exploit anti-incumbent tendencies in Massachusetts. And all the Democratic losers in the past 25 years have been people that came out of state government. Martha Coakley's the state attorney general. Shannon O'Brien, who lost to Mitt Romney, was also attorney. I'm sorry, she was a state treasurer. And then before that, Scott Harshberger was a Democrat who was attorney general. He lost, I believe, to Frank Salucci. So when you come out of the muck of state government, you've made lots of decisions. You've had to weigh in on controversial matters. Particularly the Attorney General just gets their nose into everything. It's unavoidable, and that's not a great base. It's not a great starting point for an election. Whereas a Deval Patrick never ran for anything in Massachusetts before. He had come out of the federal government bureaucracy, as did Elizabeth Warren. She had no record in state politics, no votes to defend.
Same thing happening in North Carolina right now, by the way. That's hurting Tom Tillis, the fact that he's in the state house, and you would think that Hagan would have the problem, but in fact it's Tillis that has the problem from too much stuff on the record.
Right. So not only do you not have to defend controversial choices when you are coming from outside of state politics, you get to talk a bigger game. You can say, I want to do this big, wonderful, giant idea, and you get to talk about that and not get bogged down in your past record. So, there's a lot of institutional disadvantages that Coakley has to overcome. And quite frankly, people talk about there being a glass ceiling in Massachusetts politics, and I feel it's sort of less about sort of outright sexism as opposed to women trying to get ahead in politics, doing what you would do in any other kind of profession. Start at the bottom and work your way up. You get penalized for doing that in politics, because then you have to suffer all your past record. So it's an unfair mountain that Coakley has to climb. Yet she's still in the mix. It's only a few point race, and like with every other race in this state, you just don't know how good the ground game is going to be. And then there's a little weird thing that happened just this week, which I have no idea if it's going to be a big deal or not. We had a tearjerker moment in the last debate where the candidates were asked, when was the last time you cried? Which is kind of an unfair question in itself, because if a woman is talking about her crying, it doesn't look as good as when a man's talking about he's crying, showing he's not, because the whole knock on Baker from Coakley is that he's a CEO, he's got no heart, he's all about the bottom line, doesn't care about people. Now he's got a free shot to talk about his emotions. So he tells this story. He said, just the other day I was asked a similar question. And during this campaign, I met a fisherman, and he was telling me his story about how he wouldn't let his kids go to college because they had to be fishermen too, and now he feels like he's ruined their life because the fishing industry in Massachusetts has had lots of problems, and people blame federal regulations for that. And he felt guilty that he ruined his son's lives. And so Baker really starts to break down and cry in this debate. And even then on top, he gets magnanimous and then turns to Coakley and thanks her for her efforts on the subject. So he seems like this totally wonderful, awesome guy doing this. And there are people, saying he won the race on that alone. The next day, it turns out he told that same story in the last gubernatorial campaign. So he was wrong in saying it was during this campaign. It now seems like it's kind of a stock story that he tells, not something he was sort of recently affected by. He was asked by a reporter, does this person really exist? And he said, well, he exists to me, which may be an honest answer, but it certainly was not the best way to phrase that. So is this going to be a big deal in the last days of the campaign? I don't know, but it's those sort in a close race. This is why I feel like predictions can be dicey propositions. You don't know what might tip a race in the final days when things are that close. What might move an undecided voter?
Right.
Is this going to be a gaffe that trips a Baker? I don't know.
Right. Well, Hillary Clinton, I guess, tearing up in New Hampshire in 2012. Or in 2008. I mean, 2008. I think helped her. So you never know.
Yeah, I mean, you at the moment you weren't sure. Was that going to doom her?
Right.
That she broke down in a moment of stress. But no, it became a rallying cry for women voters in the state, thinking she was getting a raw deal. That combined with Obama's ill-timed comment, "You're likable enough," all that create a bit of a perfect storm for Hillary. So these last-minute events, in close races, can upend expectations.
Well, we could go on, Bill. I think we've probably done a pretty good job here. Anything else you want to add?
Well, you were telling me beforehand that these fundraising emails are sticking in your craw.
Well, no, I have an interesting sort of take on it, right? So, anyone who's on any of these lists has been inundated with emails from politicians and party committees, and they're getting really sort of creepy in some cases. Like you'll get an email from like Joe Biden, like, "I hope you still believe in me," or something like that. But the weird thing is, Bill, for people like you and me, and people who work in politics, they're even more. The point is for the subject lines to sort of look like they're real emails, right? And they're getting more clever. They'll put like the RE : so it looks like they're responding to something you sent sometimes. And for the irony is that that people like who cover politics, who write about politics all the time, tend to be like more cynical and skeptical than the general public, I think. But in this case, I think we're more susceptible. Like, for example, I got one from just today. I got one from Marco Rubio, and it says, "Do you remember when?" ... And I open it up, and it's Matt. I can still remember that first moment when I decided to run for the United States Senate. You know, and it's a BS like blast email. And I'm now I'm at the point I think where most of us are, where I basically 90% of the emails I get are spam, and I go through very quickly and delete. Don't even open, just delete most emails that people send me. And every once in a while, I will accidentally delete a real email from a real person, like totally inadvertently, because I think it's spam. And so I was saying, like, what if Marco Rubio, because look, the odds are not high that Marco Rubio is going to sit down and send me a real email, but it's not utterly impossible that Rubio might actually email me someday something. And so, like, what if he was sending me these series of, like, really, really, like, sincere emails, and I kept deleting them? Something about that just struck me as funny, that when I see an email, and it's not always like Marco Rubio, it might be like Paul Begala. Like, I've been on TV with Paul Begala. I know Paul Begala a little bit, and so it's not beyond the pale that it's not absurd that Paul Begala might email me, right? But when I get them, and it says something like, "I just have two things to say," right? Now I'll delete it. It could actually be Paul Begala emailing me. And so, like, I'm probably more likely to open up these spam emails than Joe Blow. Anyway, I just found that interesting, and it would be funny if Marco Rubio's like, it turns to his like press guy. I don't know, Matt Lewis isn't returning my emails. I keep sending him these really heartfelt emails about my campaign. Anyway,
actually, I read Dave Weigel, the journalist who jumped from Slate to Bloomberg recently, because Bloomberg is beefing up their political team. I had read that the job offer was the initial outreach to Weigel from the guy at Bloomberg. The subject line was Nigerian investment opportunity.
Yeah,
which obviously could have been very easily deleted, but it was not.
Oh no, I have deleted very important emails from people because and nowadays, like, a lot of times the subject will be like, Matt, this is important. And it's from, like, Paul Begala. You know what I mean? Like, and right. You just get into the habit of, I go through and, I'll go out to lunch or something. I come back, I've got, 100 emails, and I'll just go through and delete 90 of them. And I'm just making these assumptions that they're spam, and they almost always are, but sometimes they're not. And maybe Marco Rubio has been sending me urgent personal messages, pouring out his heart about this race, and I am not responding to him. And he thinks I'm, a horrible person. It could be. Matt, I just need 5 minutes of your time. Please.
Now, I feel like these fundraising emails have gotten a bad rap as of late because, Jon Stewart did a whole Daily Show riff on, how the Democratic ones are so, urgent, all is lost, all that kind of stuff. I even saw Marcos call out the DCCC for a subject line that was all is lost, throw in the towel, go home, all these counterintuitive subject lines. And it just strikes me that's sort of an unfair attack, because if the parties did not do this, then they would have no small donor base. They'd only would have big money donations coming from elite, closed press soirees. And if you don't want that, if you want to see our campaign finance system be democratized, whether you want it on the left through public financing or from the right through increased transparency, I think both parties have some interest in expanding their donor bases. You're only going to do that through emails. It's not going to, direct mail is only going to get you so far. And both parties have part of the name of the game of online activism is experimentation, because people's sensibilities are constantly shifting, and what subject line works one week isn't going to work the next week, and so it's this constant churn of trial and error. and they all have they're all collecting the data. They all know what their open rates are. They don't know what has click throughs and whatnot. So yeah, they're going to do some things that seem silly sometimes because they have to try new things all the time.
Yeah. You're right. No, you're right. But what bugs me about it is everything. See, we're all lab rats, and we're all being studied, and and so we are inundated by stimuli that our parents, grandparents never had to deal with, right? And so it's not just these emails figuring out a way to get us to open them. It's everything, right? I mean, they're trying to find a way to make us buy a cheeseburger, and they're studying us. And how can they present the ad? I mean, the seduction that we are subjected to constantly. And we try to hide from these. We try to hide from the advertisements and insulate ourselves from it, and then it's just a game of one-upmanship, where we invent a way to hide from the advertisers and hide from them, and they invent a way to overcome it. And although you're right, I mean, if we want to have a free country, there's no way around this. It does strike me that we are like inundated by messages, people pushing things on us all the time. And I do wonder about what it does to our psyche for us to have to find ways to hide from them and to resist these like increasingly, it's everybody who's selling you things, from pornography to cheeseburgers to pizza to political campaigns, is studying sociology, psychology, and finding ways, if we just say it like this, if we just show the picture like this, if we just make it easy to click the button like this, we are inundated by people really drilling down on how to get us to do things. And I wonder about like the long-term effect this is having on us, having to deal with this in society.
Well, I'm gonna give you the last words. I know you have to jump and I have to jump. But I guess we need to go on the record, right? We need to have our useless, humiliating predictions before we go, right?
Yeah, well, it's not a show if we don't embarrass ourselves in some way. And so I guess I'll go first. I'm going to say Republicans on election night. Tell me if this is a good enough prediction, or if it's too weaselly. I am going to say that Wednesday morning we will know that Republicans have the majority. So we're not going to be waiting for Georgia. We're not going to be waiting for Louisiana. We're not going to be waiting for Alaska. That Wednesday morning we will safely know that that Mitch McConnell, and by the way, it will be Mitch McConnell. He will survive. That Mitch McConnell will be the majority leader come next cycle. That's my prediction.
All right. Well, I'm gonna try to do this the old-fashioned way.
Is that too Weasley, by the way?
No, I'll take it. I'll
Okay.
take it. But I was do state by state in my head. So Republicans will get Montana and West Virginia. Those will be two pickups.
Okay.
I'll give them South Dakota, although I do think if Pressler collapses totally and those votes go to Weiland, he might have an upset there. But I won't predict that. So that's 3. I'm going to give them I'll give them Louisiana post runoff, and Arkansas. That's 5. But I'm going to be optimistic, and I think McConnell will survive in Kentucky. So I'm going to give him 5, but I'm going to be optimistic in Colorado, Iowa, New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Georgia. So that would be a Dem pickup in Georgia. And that would give Republicans net 4. And I also think Orman's going to win in Kansas, and that would make it a +3, assuming Orman caucus with Democrats. And I think that would, if that actually bore out, then it wouldn't be a swing proposition for Ormond to flip, if my math is correct, because the Republicans would only end up with
So
with 40.
you're picking only
total.
a pickup of 3?
I'm going to go out and go way
You
out
are
on
on a limb, man. I mean, look, Ernst is up by, 4 or 5 points in Iowa. Gardner's up by at least 5 in Colorado. This is a bold prediction, Bill. This is a bold. Like I said, I had Josh Kraushaar and Alexis Levinson on. They're saying 9. You're saying 3. That's a lot of room there. So that's a lot of range.
The Real Clear poll average in Colorado for Gardner is 3.6, but I think we're not taking account of the fact that it is a vote by mail election, which I think is going to change the voter pool there. So that's one thing which I think is underplayed. And in Iowa, I feel like those numbers aren't as bold as you made them. The Real Clear polling average there is 2.1 for Ernst. The 2 most recent polls, 4 most recent, Ernst 4, Braley 1, Ernst 3, tie.
Right. But she's been, I feel like she's been consistently ahead, and also there's the sort of evidence based on early voting and absentee voting or whatever that's coming in that's showing the Republicans are overperforming there. So anyway, it's a bold prediction of 3 pickups for a Republican. We shall see, Bill, but I'll give you credit for being willing to make a gutsy prediction.
Anyone who's been watching this show for a very long time knows that I am often wrong.
Yes.
So
I take solace in the fact that you're...
It is only so much of a risk one is taking.
All right. Well, we'll talk about it next week then, right?
All right.
Have a good one.
Take care.